All right. I want to thank Bryce for being here for another conversation. We just spoke about how race and ethnicity are constructed, some of the different dynamics, the complications around that, particularly around the Black community in America, in terms of history and in terms of modern day situations as well. Now we're going to turn our attention to Nella Larsen's novel, Passing. Passing was published in 1929, and it's a classic of both American modernism and of the Harlem Renaissance. It's a slim little novel of about 120 pages, but Larsen does some really intriguing and complicated work around what it means to be Black, what it means to pass for white, who gets to decide these things for the individual, the internalization of racial hatred and racism within the self, through the characters of Irene and Claire in particular. And the students in reading this book had a lot of questions around, especially Claire's character. Claire is not the consciousness that we're embedded in. She's kind of the consciousness that's being viewed by Irene. Irene is, we would say Irene is the main character, because we've got third person limited omniscient narration, which means we're grounded in Irene's consciousness, even though we're talking about Irene in the third person. The perspective is Irene's. But she's watching her friend Claire. And friend is a strong word for it, right? Her acquaintance, Claire.
Her acquaintance, her homie, kind of.
They grew up in the same community, but Claire was always kind of an outsider to that community. She wanted to get out of it. She hated being poor, even more so than being Black. What seemed to bother Claire was being poor. And Claire was, she's biracial, yeah. And she appears white to people. She has fair skin, she's got golden hair, big brown eyes, and so people just assume that she is white because of the way that she looks. And so she uses this to her personal advantage to secure a very wealthy husband and to secure the life of leisure and ease that she had always wanted. What troubled the students, of course, is Claire's husband, who is incredibly racist. Not just like racist or kind of a little bit racist, but well, it's just kind of part of the time he was in. No, this man is like openly, aggressively racist. Yeah. And Claire seems to be happy to live with him. So one of the questions that really came up for the students was, what motivates Claire to pass as white, but especially to pass as white with John, with this horrible, awful human being? So I'd like to spend some time thinking about Claire's motivation and the structures that cause her to want to pass as white, but then to want to pass in such a way that costs her so much personally, or that at least to the students and to me as well as a reader feels like it would cost her so much personally. So, I mean, like, what do you think about Claire's character? I find her complicated. I don't know what to make of her.
It is. Yeah, I think Claire's quite complicated. Where do I even start? There's so many good, rich questions. Maybe we'll start with feelings. I'm a big fan of talking about feelings, and then we can, get into thinking, academia. We do lots of thinking and musing. I think part of me, honestly, this is weird. I haven't thought about this. I think I feel a sense of kinship is maybe the word I'm looking for with Claire for a number of reasons that I can elaborate on. But I think I also see, to a degree, like some of myself in Claire, which feels weird, right? Like, man, yeah, I'm like a little bit shook as I'm thinking through this. I should have like done more reflecting. But what I mean by seeing myself reflected in Claire is there's a desire. I think Claire is conscious of how race and economic status are intricately connected. Mm-hmm. Very, very much so. Which, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, understanding how, again, racism has always been attached to an economic system, right? Race then coming out of racism, right? So you have race, racism, and economic system always being interconnected. And if you look at contemporary, like, stats around wealth and distribution of wealth in the U.S., you'll see that is still very much true. Right. And so I think what feels familiar is she sees this and she's like, I want out. Mm-hmm. And I want to be able to have, quote unquote, the finer things and all this sort of stuff, right? So I think there's something about this idea of American dream and what it means to do what you have to do to get what you have to get to go where you want to go. Mm-hmm. I think that that's a pretty staple of the quote unquote American dream. And I recognize that, right? I remember a child being told, like, you can be anything you want to be, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's true for some,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think it's true for some. But imagine telling a black person that, right? In this case, this is like 1920s, 29. Is that the year?
Yeah, publication date, yeah.
Right. So you're having like, it's also coming off the Great Depression, which isn't going to be too different than it feels like where we are now, right? But imagine telling a black person in the 1920s, you can be whatever you want to be. That's not necessarily going to feel true unless you're someone like Claire, who has the ability to pass,
Right.
and therefore get access to power and wealth via race in that context. So in a way, like, she's just sort of fulfilling and buying into this dream that had been instilled within her. That's why Claire feels familiar. What's different, though, is that I don't have the ability to pass the way that Claire does. Mm-hmm. And so there's a level of accountability that I have to communities that I belong to. And I think that's the difference. And if I were to articulate a second feeling, it's this idea of frustration, I think, towards Claire. Mm-hmm. Part of what it means to be Black is to not only walk through life being seen and treated as Black, which doesn't sound like Claire has after her father died, right? Different periods of her life. But it also means being committed to the uplifting and empowering of Black humanity, right? I think that's part of what it means to be Black as well. And I think that's something that Claire has somewhat intentionally divorced from her life, right? Is that commitment to the uplifting and empowering of Black humanity. Right. And that is frustrating. I think that's what frustrates Irene as well. Mm-hmm. Right? That in the pursuit of her own, again, social status, access to wealth, access to power, she has divorced herself from not only the Black community, but a commitment to the uplifting of the Black community, which particularly in Harlem, in the Harlem Renaissance, right? That is like one of like the core struggles is like, to what degree do we have internal freedom that allows us to live our life and to be human, which is true. And to what degree, as Black folks living in the early 20th century, do we have to remain committed to the uplifting of a Black community? Because we are literally being lynched and killed on a daily basis. Oh. So to not be committed to that is to be complicit in harm that is being done to families, that is decimating families, right? Those are the tensions, right? And I think Claire represents that tension really well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel a similar frustration with her, just as a reader, seeing the way that she is stepping away from her community and allowing other people to continue to suffer while she enjoys privilege. And part of that, I think, comes from the way that she treats the Black community in Harlem when she's so desperate to like attend the dance and to kind of just attend the parties.
That's right.
It's hard to tell whether it's a sort of voyeuristic wanting to experience this almost like her own exoticization of Black culture, or is it really she's seeking for lost community? And I think both of those are probably at work within her.
Yeah.
But it troubles me the way in which she also feels like a voyeur of that community or a consumer of that community is maybe a better word for it.
Consumer, I think, is super accurate. And part of me is, okay, I'll say it. This could ruffle some feathers. You can also edit it out. I trust you. Right? So it feels somewhat similar to voluntourism. And by that, what I mean is, I think within our spirits, there's a sense of common humanity and bond that God puts in us, right? Meaning across these sort of like literally man-made borders, we sense a common humanity that we have with our brothers and sisters around the world, right? That the knowledge of that truth leads us to want to see and to experience life and humanity with our brothers and sisters. I think that's true. What I've seen, though, and I think what's troubling, is that how oftentimes we go about that. So the process of trying to engage in humanity ends up reinforcing power structure. So it's like, oh, let me go, but then not just to experience and do life with people, but like bring X, Y, and Z, whether it's, let bring culture, or let me bring a sense of sophistication, or let me bring whatever material object that I think is valuable, but doesn't actually hold value in that other culture, ends up being sort of attached to this desire to see and connect with humanity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think what's problematic then is that it keeps this power structure that says, oh no, like, well, I'm the one bringing this, right? I'm the asset. I'm bringing the value, right? Which is deeply problematic if we are to assume that all of us hold a common humanity where we can mutually learn and see an image of God that otherwise we may not be able to see, right? There's a common image of God that we hold in a uniqueness that is equally valuable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think recognizes that common humanity with Black folks. She, like, deeply in her spirit, I think, yearns to connect yet again with the Black community. But how she goes about it, right, are that continue to perpetuate a problematic power system that elevates herself over other people. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel a parallel frustration around the way that she uses her body as a woman, right? Because it's not just that she passes as white, but that she's beautiful. She's always dressed in ways to be the woman that is receiving not just the white gaze, but the male gaze specifically. Sure. And I mean, I think that's another area in which we see the construction of identity in this book being kind of interrogated. And yeah, as a woman, I watch her doing that and knowing that she's dressing, you know, it's very clear from the way that Irene describes her that she is dressing in ways and doing her hair in ways to draw the attention and the attraction and to, you know, channel male desire her way. And obviously that's what she did to land her husband as well, right? You know?
Sure.
And I hate it as a woman that she does that, and yet I know that I am guilty of exactly the same thing.
Sure.
Because
part of me wonders, though. Yeah, part of me, I agree with you. I think you're spot on. And it's always fun, right, to try to get into the mind of characters and be like, well, why might she do this?
Yeah.
Part of me wonders if how she presents and how she uses her body as a woman is another way of trying to conceal her racial identity. Meaning, if I can draw attention to myself in what I wear, I think, again, she also dresses in a way that sort of symbolically communicates a level of status, right? So if I can communicate my status in society, if I can communicate, again, an outward sort of beauty in terms of what I wear, might that be distracting enough that people don't even begin to question my racial identity, right? So her physical presentation is yet another function of trying to racially pass because of the risks that being sort of caught or found out, right, would present to her being, as well as like her dreams of, you know, wealth and all this sort of American dream stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I think for women, this definitely continues today as well in terms of other ways in which women will try to attract attention to their, you know, try to attract attention to our bodies so that people don't question other parts of our lives. Or I think that's one of the reasons why. So I'm thinking of another conversation I was having around the book of Ruth and the way that Naomi, you know, dresses Ruth up to go into the threshing floor to attract Boaz. That it's partly to distract from the fact that she's a Moabite, right?
Oh, sure.
But then coming out of that came the conversations about the assumption that is made in public where if a woman gets a promotion, you know, who did she sleep with to get there, sure. Right? And this kind of this constant link between setting yourself up a certain way physically gives you access to power, but in doing that, you're undermining like the actual valuing of the self.
For sure.
But if you actually get there because of your own merits and because you're capable, people still assume that it must be because of
what you.
So I'm thinking about kind of those intersectionalities again of gender and race and economics, right? Because it is a very tight package for women, for men too, but in a different way.
Most definitely, right? I mean, so what we're talking about, and this we could do like a whole class, but when you're looking at each individual, again, social identity, there are histories and power dynamics within each one, right? And so I could talk about my identity as, again, if we use those three, we'll say, again, Black, male, and like pretty solidly middle class if I don't think about my student loans. Some of y'all students, you know. And yeah, where I exist in a targeted identity around my Blackness, I hold significant power and privilege in my male identity, right? And relative power and privilege around my socioeconomic identity. And those are always at play at once when I'm interacting with the world, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you're spot on. When we think about how we walk through the world, it can't be through singular lenses, because reality is the world isn't also going to be seeing us through singular lenses, right? We're consistently navigating multiple identities.
And I think that's what makes Larsen's book such a brilliant kind of psychological portrait, is the way that you get these multiple lenses being interrogated through Irene and through Claire, as Claire is also, Irene is wrestling with her own identity as a Black woman who has chosen to live in Harlem. She's married to a Black man. She at one point comments that one of her children is dark, so you get the colorism issue there. But she can also pass as white, and does occasionally when it is convenient.
Yeah, for sure.
And kind of, you know, the dynamics around the way that she is negotiating her own femininity, her race, and her class. Which then comes up around Brian's affair, of course, with Claire.
Gosh, yeah.
And maybe we can spend some time just thinking about Irene. Why does Irene dislike Claire so much, and why is she fascinated by Claire? I mean, there's almost a desire between, like, for Irene to be Claire.
Yeah. I think you're spot on. I think that's the answer to your question, right? I think part of why Irene holds such disdain for Claire is because Claire represents aspects of herself that she doesn't have the freedom to pursue, right? And so someone's like, I hate what I can't have, right? Sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, Claire, for all of her, we'll say, problems and flaws, there's a sort of audacious freedom that she lives into, right? We're just say, like, I'm gonna live my life, right? Societal expectations of me, you know, racial community expectations of me be damned. I'm gonna live my life and do me amidst all the risks. And I think there's something that's attractive about that, specifically to Irene, right? Amidst other, like, kind of, you know, things that Irene's attracted to with regards to Claire. I think there's that. And I think, again, Irene knows that, like, there's like a bit of it, you know, there's the initial scene in Chicago on the roof that she can access, but ultimately, you know, her commitments to her children, her commitments to her husband, and ultimately her commitments to her community, right? The Black community, keep her from doing what Claire does, because Claire doesn't, you know, have those commitments to her child. Margarine, she has one, I think is what it was. Which is really interesting to hear her talk about her child. She obviously doesn't have the same commitments to the Black community, I think, or the white community, really. And then, you know, her commitments to her husband, John, obviously look, you know, very, very different. And so I think for Irene, she's frustrated by that, because I think part of her really wishes she had a little bit of that freedom, right? Again, which speaks to these broader systems where racially, she doesn't have that freedom. Gender-wise, she doesn't have that freedom. And even I think socioeconomically, right? It sounds like, again, because of the role that her husband plays, it sounds like, right, as a breadwinner and being a medical person, creates pressure on her to not be able to express that freedom, right? And I think that's part of why. The second thing, going back to what I said earlier around being Black and sort of Blackness being connected to a commitment to community and to struggle and uplifting the Black community, I think that also really frustrates Irene, right? Is she sees Claire, who's wanting to come in and almost sort of parasitically sort of drain, right, life and to be fulfilled through the dances and, you know, the vibrancy that exists within the Black community without a commitment to doing the work to uplifting the Black community, right? So I use parasitically because that's what a parasite does, right? He just comes and leeches. There's no mutuality. There's no sense of, you know, being involved in a community, and that's what creates life that sustains us. It's, yet again, let me come and use you in your community to benefit myself, which is eerily, you know, sort of similar to the histories of how white folks used you know, Black folks in this country for their own purposes.
I mean, that's interesting to think of Irene then as actually not only having passed for white, but is now actually performing whiteness in that really, like.
You mean Claire?
Sorry, Claire. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Claire is not only performing, not only has she passed for white, but she is now performing whiteness in her use of the Black community.
Yes, yes, most definitely.
Parasitic way, which, I mean, passing for white, or has she passed over to being white? Which
That's a good question.
with the window
Yeah.
at the end, right? Okay, so many things. So first of all, I just want to comment on the scene at the beginning of the second section when Irene literally walks past the man who is passed out on the street so that she can get in the taxi and ascend into the elevator. I think one of the, as we think about close reading of this text, one of the things that Larsen is signaling for us here is exactly to be attentive to this dynamic. Who are you passing by or passing over as you pass for white and literally ascend to the top floor of the hotel to escape the problems and the heat and all of that below, which again is exactly what you were saying with Irene's kind of critique of Clare. But then at the end, of course, Irene potentially, it looks like, pushes Clare out the window, kills her. And I'm thinking about that around, like, you know, it's obviously a very violent rejection of Clare's path. But is that mark of that, is that moment of rejecting Clare and she literally passes through the window to but is it also a moment of that she has passed into whiteness? She is kind of dead to this community as well because she is using us.
Sure, totally.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think, there's a lot. I mean, that's spot on, right? I mean, again, to be clear, like the color of one's skin, right? Go back to what I said in the previous section. How you were seen, how you're treated, is very much a function, right, and a core of race. That is true. And there are scholars. I'm thinking of. There's a guy named Willie Jennings who's done a lot of work around race, who talks about whiteness as this sort of like stream in this river. And what he would say is like anyone can step into the stream of whiteness. Now, again, to be clear, I'm not saying anybody gets to be white. Like I can't walk outside and be like, "Hey, y'all, I'm white." I don't know if you knew. Like that's just not going to happen. But there is something about white culture, right? In the same way, like let's take George Fox, for example. Yeah, to be a student at George Fox, you know, you have to go to George Fox for own classes. But there are also unique, I think, cultural dynamics of George Fox, right? That people can take on. So let's say you're living off campus with other folks that don't go to George Fox. You may bring that George Fox culture, and that person who doesn't go to George Fox could still engage in George Fox culture, right? Whatever that may be, if that makes sense, right? They're like, yeah, I love being known. And it's like, what? Okay, yeah. So I think similarly, when we talk about whiteness, people can buy into the culture of whiteness and white ideology without being white, right? And so, you know, I think the $1 million question is, you know, is Clare white? Is a really hard question to answer, and I don't know if there's a clean answer. I have some thoughts, but regardless of the answer to that question, I think it's pretty clear that she has bought into white culture and whiteness as an ideology, right, that is exploiting Black bodies quite literally, right, that is pursuing her own desires at the expense of other people, right, which would be another marker of a white ideology. And so that's interesting. There's a guy named Cornel West, who might be familiar with, other students may as well, who's done a lot of great work around race, and he would say that he's still trying to kill the white supremacist in himself, right? So white supremacy is something that can live within the consciousness and the behaviors and the attitudes of anyone, regardless of their racial identity. And I think something to be considered.
Wow. So thinking about that line, still trying to kill the white supremacist within himself, and thinking of Irene pushing Clare out the window in the same way that she smashes the Confederate teacup. Because she always hated it and she wants to be rid of it.
That's right.
Does Irene,
that could be her trying to kill the white supremacists in her, like, for sure.
Literally killing the whites. I'm pushing. I've got windows behind me, as you can see. Like thinking about, like, she's literally killing the white supremacist in her in killing Clare. Yeah. And it's a very like violent and very kind of concretization, if I can even say that word, a literalization of that act, right? Because Clare is not only a threat, because Clare, I think that when Irene does that, she is kind of saying, no, I, Irene, am viewing you, Clare, as fundamentally white.
For sure. And
in killing you, I am being freed from that.
Yeah.
And that you bring, even as you've brought this fascination and awakened this desire within me.
Yep.
I am actively rejecting that, but also the threat that is to her family, right? Because her husband, Brian, she's pretty sure is having an affair with Clare.
For sure. And yes, you're like right on the nose. And I think what we know, I'll say what I know, and I'm gonna guess as you know, and I think it's worth explicitly saying, is that Irene killing Claire maybe in the moment feels like some sort of like cathartic action that is like cleansing the white supremacist in her, but that's not actually going to be the case, right? Irene's going to wake up the next morning and realize, oh snap, like the same sort of ideologies and this is still there, right? And so there's an internal healing process that needs to occur, because at the end of the day, I think with Irene, it isn't even really about Claire. Like it is about Claire, but Claire really just symbolizes what's already in Irene, right? And I think it's highly possible too. Again, Claire is a projection of an inner Irene, right? That for that white supremacist. And this is the part that maybe feels a little bit dangerous. So you can also edit this out too. So I talked a little bit about, right, the history specifically between white folks and black folks in the U.S. Blackness was created right now. Okay, I'll say it, then I'll edit, go back and sort of nuance it. In a lot of ways, how blackness was initially constructed was from the position of white folks, right? Like those in positions of power. So how people are conceptualized. So go back, like I said, to this idea of the black brute, right? Whose desire is to rape a white woman, who wants to dominate everything around him. That was not created, right, by black folks. That was created specifically by white men, which then led to and was sort of used to justify the killing of black men.
Yeah.
The context now between Irene and Claire, I think the same way in which Irene projecting aspects of herself onto Claire, right, and then killing Claire as a way to try to like internally cleanse himself. I think how, again, historically, right, these white men were killing specifically black men, black folks broadly. And the rationalization was because of like internally what was going on. The realization that like slave owners were the ones that were trying to dominate, that were out raping, right, black women.
Right.
There's an internal thing there that I think in the spirit, right? I think as people, again, who were created good, who bear the image of God, that God like knew us in our mother's wombs, or something, right, within, I think, the spirit of slaveholders that knew that what they're doing is wrong. Yeah. And how they were trying to deal with that was through projecting onto others a specific image that was within themselves in an attempt to try to kill that image. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that makes a lot of sense too than of what Irene is doing as she projects onto Claire what she dislikes about herself, and then has to kill that. But I mean, insofar as we read Claire as a literal character in the book,
correct, right?
Obviously, there's a lot of you can't push people out the window just because you projected all of your bad stuff onto them.
Don't do that. That would be bad. I would highly recommend don't do that. But do the internal healing thing, not the pushing out the window thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's a question though. If it's you floated before the idea, like what if Claire is actually like just Irene's split personality, sort of alter ego?
Totally.
Does that change the way we read Irene's killing of Claire at the end if it's not another person who she's projecting her own desire and her own complicitness in broken system and her own fears and all that? If it's actually just a part of herself that she is choosing to kill off, does that change the way we read? Because I'm thinking about the example you just gave of white slave owners who are projecting their own violence and their own evil onto the black male and then killing the black male. Obviously, that's awful. If they just recognize within themselves that and try to kill that off within themselves, it seems to change the like ethics of the move.
Totally. Yeah. Yes. So to the latter part of what you just said, I think in that example, if there were like white slave owners that were internally like, ooh, I'm messing up, I'm doing bad, I need to do better, I think that would probably generally be accepted, right, like as a good thing. Totally. Now there are a lot of other parts that would have to go a part of that. That would have to be part of that. But I think what makes the situation with Claire and Irene a little bit more complex, right, going back to intersectionality, the fact that Claire represents not only, let's say, aspects of whiteness, but also a what's the word, like an audacious femininity that isn't right, that isn't sort of submitting herself to the same, there's still a level of it, but is, you know, living out her femininity in different ways, right? Sleeping with men outside of her marriage, going out on her own. She's called back. She's like, I'm gonna go to this dance whether you invite me or not, Irene, right? Taking trips, you know, away from her husband, like all this sort of stuff. That's a level of femininity that is transgressing gender roles of that time period. Claire represents that as well, right? And so I think it would be too simple to say that this sort of metaphorical killing off of Claire is this sort of triumphing over the sort of internalized racism that Irene may have. I think that's true, and coupled with that is a acknowledging or maybe submitting of herself and her femininity and her womanhood to the repressive and oppressive roles of what it means to be a woman at that time period. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so there's the tragic aspect as well as almost like a triumphant aspect, all wrapped up into one, given the multiple identities that Claire is holding for herself.
No, and I think that makes a lot of sense with Irene's refusal to go to Brazil with Bryce, right? That no, she wants kind of the status quo and the security of the role of wife and mother, wife of the doctor, right? Kind of what she knows in America, the security and structure of her role as mother. She speaks very highly about being a mother, the responsibility it brings toward others.
Yes, that's right.
So it is also a, in killing Claire, be it metaphorically or, I mean, obviously, literally it has different layers of problems, but it does have this reaffirmation of a certain sort of very highly prescriptive and very conventional femininity that she is simultaneously adhering to, that especially as contemporary readers or modern readers, we may find problematic.
Sure, yeah.
So one of the other questions that came up, and this will be the last question that we'll wrestle with, a lot of the students were asking about the ethics of Claire passing as white.
Yeah.
You know, is it okay to do this? And I mean, partly as a person who, you know, I'm not a person of color, so I feel like I don't have any position to comment on the ethics of that. But I think that underlying their question as well is the bigger question of who gets to decide the ethics of that, right?
Yeah.
And asking that question, I think what they're more deeply interrogating is who gets to decide whether this is an ethical act or not. And I think we definitely have a deep tension in that question of kind of American individuality.
Yeah.
Like, and the ethics of the individual versus the ethics of the community. As you know, and for the students who have not paid attention in term up to this point, this course is philosophy and literature. And specifically, we're looking at ethics at the margins. How do the great Western ethical systems help us or not help us when we wrestle with these sorts of questions of real life? And so we've talked about Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, and thinking about kind of how would they judge different characters' ethical actions, and do we as readers feel like their ethical judgments would be like good ones or bad ones, as kind of just a way of allowing literature to go back and then interrogate the philosophy, right? And say, well, this all sounds really lovely, Mill, or this sounds really lovely, Kant, but it just doesn't seem to work when we get into this real life situation anymore. So that's where their question of the ethics of this, I think, is coming from, is like, is it ethical to pass? And I mean, I think Kant would say, no, it's not, because you're lying. Lying is always unethical. Even his famous addendum is, even if you're doing it to save someone's life, it's still wrong to lie. So the murderer comes to your door and says, I'm looking for Jessica. If you try to lie for me, Bryce, you are being unethical in that moment. Your job is to tell him where I am, or to not say anything, but you cannot lie to protect me. And he has this whole like reasoning, and the students were kind of like, yeah, we're not sure we're there with him. But so far as you're lying when you're passing, it's unethical. But then of course that raises the question, well, is it a lie?
Sure. I mean, that gets to like ontology, right? Or like epistemology as well. Like, what is truth? And we're talking about like relative truths. Like, I mean, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, and Claire has white relatives, so she's not actually lying when she's passing.
I mean, if so, one could. So I would be with the students in the sense of like, I don't know if I can be on board with Kant, but if I were to try to like reconcile a Kantianness,
Yeah.
that's my own word. Somebody else maybe put it up.
Kantian, it's a word.
Thank you. Kantianness, right? With that situation, I'd probably be like, race is socially constructed, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've constructed a certain way, society's constructed a certain way. My own construction is that this is what I am. And I could like try to somewhat convince myself that what I'm saying is actually true. Yeah, but that's hard. Yeah, like I said, I can't really get on board with Kant. There's Mill, right? So you all have talked about Mill, and this idea of the greatest happiness, the most happiness for the most people.
Yeah.
Right. Around the ethics of identity. Before I go on, I'm gonna pause and say like, I'm a fan of like, let people live their life. Right. So students that know me well will know that like one of my favorite phrases is like, you live your life, right? There's a freedom. So I try not to play the like role of the police officer, right? I'm not gonna like police people's tone and how they speak. I'm not gonna police like who gets to identify this way and who doesn't get to identify that way, for a lot of reasons, but mostly because like I have or would like to think I have enough humility to say like I don't really know everything, right? So you spoke about your you said Venezuelan family.
My dad's a Venezuelan citizen. Yeah.
Your dad, right? Like I may look and be like, nah, that's not true. But like, who am I to say that, right? Again, who's giving me the power to dictate who somebody is and who somebody isn't? Because the reality is there are aspects of all of our stories that we're not going to know. And I've had plenty of people that are like, you're not Chinese. I'm like, no, like really I am. They just don't know, right? And so in general, I would say applying to like a life, which means like really matters, I try not to tell people who they are and who they are. I can ask questions. I can have my own thoughts, but I'm not gonna like tell them to their face.
Yeah.
Okay, so now to the ethics of it. I would probably fall more under Mill, for example, right? In that when you look at passing, I think passing is do I want us to feel comfortable saying this? Like, yeah, I think so. Almost always a vehicle or a tool for a particular purpose, right? So my concern becomes, well, what is that purpose? What work does passing do? In the situation with Claire, to me, I think she is using her ability to pass for her own individual gain, right? Again, someone who is committed, or at least would like to be, desires to be committed to uplifting Black folks and humanity and all people, that feels wrong. That would feel unethical, but not because she's passing so much as why she's passing.
Yeah.
Right? Now, there are other folks who throughout history have used their ability to pass to actually reduce harm and uplift, right, the Black community, right, that use the access that passing gives them to be able to get power to reduce harm. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right. Now, in this case, passing is talking about one's like phenotype, and the ability to phenotypically pass, right? But there are also ways that people can, again, maybe passing isn't the same word, but can alter self to get access to certain spaces, right? So for example, this idea of code switching comes up a lot, particularly for people of color who maybe speak in a specific way around their friends, their family, and then get around predominantly white spaces and shift their language, right? So this idea of code switching. I code switch all day, every day. I guarantee you, like how I'm talking on this like phone call with you and students around George Fox, people are like, oh, he's so articulate, this, and this. Is like be very different if you like get me around like my brother or you get me around some other friends. Like some of the stuff may not always be GFA. GFA aside, how we speak and engage with each other is different, right? So I code switch. And the question is why? I don't think the act of me code switching is unethical, but I think how and why I code switch could be unethical. Now, if I'm code switching just like for my own personal gain, would probably not be super ethical. But the reality is I code switch because I think it gives me access to spaces where people can hear what I'm trying to say, right? In the hope that if people can hear what I'm trying to say, it could change how we engage with one another to create space for life, if that makes sense, right? Because what I've experienced is that if people can't get past how you say something, it's hard for them to hear what you're saying. this case, if she were trying to use her access to John, let's say John has a whole lot of money, which it seems like he does, and she's trying to funnel this money back to her, community that helped, support her when she was a young child, like sitting on the couch, knitting or whatnot with her, drunk father, that would be down. Like, I don't think I could sit and be like, that's unethical of her to pass to do that. Right. Yeah. But she's not. And so I think her passing is, I would say in some ways unethical, but who might I say, she's got to live her life, right? People also pass that, and this is the last thing I'll say, people pass for safety as well.
Right.
Like, and we see this multiple contexts throughout history where people, for very real reasons, pass because it saves either their life or the life of others. You can go back to World War II. You can go back to the 1940s with like Japanese folks being interned. If you pass as white and it kept you and your family from being interned, like, who's going to say that's unethical, right? I mean, maybe Kant would say it's unethical because you're lying, but whatever.
We don't like this anyway.
Probably had not have to live in a situation where, like, and I don't know Kant, so somebody may be like, no, Bryce is wrong on this, that's fair. But my guess is that didn't have an experience where, like, either his life or the life of his loved ones depended on whether or not he lied. That's just my guess.
I don't know Kant's biography, but my sense is that he was pretty wealthy, pretty entitled, and didn't have very many friends at all because that was just kind of his personality type. Judging them all the time. Yeah,
you watch The Good Place? Have you seen The Good Place?
Yeah. Yeah.
The notable things in my mind, like, no one likes a moral philosopher. They don't have any. Yeah. Oh, man.
I mean, I totally hear you on, like, just, that people have to live their own lives. And I agree 100%. But as I'm also always telling my students, literature, I think, invites us, and especially a novel like this, invites us into these ethical conversations, yes. Not so that we maybe ought to go out and start judging what everybody else is doing, but so that when we're faced with our own ethical decision-making,
that's right,
we can choose, we've had practice thinking about what is the best way to respond to this situation with all of its nuances and all of its complications.
Yep.
And I think this is oftentimes what we see. So one of the things I talk with my students about is, like, where would we find Jesus in all of this? Like, what is, these dead white guys said this, all three of whom really weren't Christians. I mean, Kant, maybe, kind of, he was looking for a way to do philosophy, to do moral philosophy without any sort of religious or revelation as a basis. And Mill was actually, like, actively not a Christian. He was, like, he's raised in Victorian England, but he was not. So we've got this kind of this system that's rooted in the Christian faith. So where would where would Jesus be in this?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why he uses parables so often in his teaching is to invite us into not just, like, the answer is, yes, Irene, you've done the right thing here and the wrong thing pushing her out the window, and Claire, you've done the right thing here and the wrong. I don't think that's the reason, but rather to engage us in this process of thinking through what does it mean to live well? What does it mean to live according to love, to grace? What does it look like to enact God's grace and peace in the world? What does it look like to honor the image of God that every human being bears in those people?
Yeah.
And we get to practice that through stories, right? We get to practice what that looks like in the safe space of a parable or a novel where nobody's actually going to get hurt. Irene's feelings are not going to be hurt if I judge her for pushing Claire out the window. But that practice gives me a chance then to think about how I go and live my life in hopefully more thoughtful, appropriate.
I love that you brought up Jesus, because that changes things, right? I mean, Jesus changes everything, as cliche as it sounds, but you're right. I mean, so my go-to is, like, you got to live your life. And again, I say that because I also know not everyone identifies as Christian, right? So we know that to be true. So for me to expect or to project the expectations of Jesus on someone who doesn't know or believe in Jesus would feel unfair to a degree, right? Now, for those of us who do identify as Christian or believers and followers and lovers of Jesus, it's a different thing. Jesus still declares freedom, right? Again, how I view what Jesus accomplished on the cross is declaring freedom, right? Tearing the veil, declaring victory over powers and principalities. Like, that is true. And we have a commitment to one another, right? We become trees from which like our fruit sort of exposes the degree to which Jesus lives within us, right? So that there is a different expectation as followers of Christ, right? That connects us to one another, right? One of my favorite verses I've talked about all the time is the idea of Galatians 6, which talks about a faithfulness and a commitment to one another, right? Even in the midst of weariness. And I think that requires us to do life differently, right? To do life with one another, for one another, carrying each other's burdens, right? Looking at the life of Jesus also requires us to then look at and consider those who have been marginalized, right? Prior to Jesus, it was like, oh, you got leprosy? Yeah, I can't have that, right? Like, oh, you're a prostitute? Yeah, oh, no. Oh, you're a tax collector? Ooh, you're one of those people, right? But the life of Jesus requires us to do differently, right? To sit down and to touch the unclean, to sit down and have dinner with someone who would be sort of seen as a pariah within society, right? And even more dangerously so, allows us. So I'm thinking about the woman, right, who had been bleeding and just so badly want to get close to Jesus, right, and touch his cloak. And what happened at that point, right? She touched his cloak and he felt power leaving his body, right? See, may I look at that and like, following and living life as Jesus would call us to live it requires of us giving up our power, like giving up our power to someone who society's completely castrated, right? And like cast off, castrated, giving up that power. And so again, we think of like ethics and what does it mean to live our life. You can look at Kant, Mill, and other folks, but right, Jesus as the greatest moral philosopher to have ever walked the earth points us to a greater responsibility, right? One that helps usher in the kingdom of heaven here on earth, a particular consciousness to those on the margins, to those who have been pushed to the margins, right? In particular, that's where I'm deeply convicted, right? It's easy for me to be like, I work in higher ed, I own a house, you know, I have a relatively happy family. I think if Jesus were to come back today, it's those that were living in comfort, those that thought themselves particularly wholly knowledgeable, that Jesus critiqued more than anybody else, by far, right? Those with power, those with money, those with comfort were those that he critiqued. Right? So I try to be conscious of that and figure out, okay, how can I then be conscious of the power I have? How do I give that up as best I can, right? How do I begin to move into spaces where folks are marginalized and try to bring them back to the center, the ways in which Jesus is consistently centering those that are marginalized in an effort to bring the kingdom of heaven here on earth. That's my challenge call.
Absolutely. That is beautiful. And it makes me think then that the critique of Clare in this novel, and even to some extent Irene, would come from the desire to abandon the margin for power. That it's like it's a directional problem, right? That Clare, you said this to me before, and I loved it. That Claire's already free, and yet she's trying to pursue things, all these false gods, all these idols that she thinks is going to bring her freedom. When she's already free, and in pursuing these false idols, she's actually she's moving away from who she is as someone who bears the image of God. And so that's where the critique would lie, not in passing or not passing, but in this buying into systems of power that continue to marginalize people and not living in the freedom that Jesus has brought us to denounce those powers that hurt and oppress and continue to suck life from people in communities. So.
Spot on.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today and on Saturday. The students don't know this. We tried this on Saturday and I failed to record it somehow. So this is actually take 2. Thank you so much.
Oh, good.
Your patience, your wisdom. This has been so much fun. I do want to teach, like we should definitely try to teach a class together sometime.
I'm down. I'm down. Let me finish my dissertation first, then we can do it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. All righty.
All right.